For decades, the secluded property known as Fox Hollow Farm has remained at the center of one of Indiana's darkest and most disturbing mysteries. Behind the quiet exterior of a sprawling estate in Westfield was a story involving disappearances, unspeakable crimes, hidden human remains, and a man investigators would eventually come to suspect of being responsible for far more than could ever be definitively proven. Years later, the property would become notorious for something else entirely as well. New owners, investigators, and visitors alike began reporting strange activity. They saw shadowy figures moving through the woods, heard unexplained voices and footsteps inside otherwise empty rooms, and saw truly disturbing apparitions believed by some to be connected to the people whose remains were discovered scattered throughout the property. Even after all these years, Fox Hollow Farm may still have secrets left to reveal. So tonight, we're going back to the beginning. We'll examine the life of Herb Baumeister, the disappearances that eventually led investigators to Fox Hollow Farm, the horrifying discoveries made, and the unanswered questions surrounding additional possible victims, the hauntings, and much more. Then we'll bring the story into the present and examine the newest developments in the investigation, including what authorities have learned, which mysteries may finally be closer to being solved, and why the truth about Fox Hollow Farm may still be emerging. So join me as we dive back into the horrifying true story of Fox Hollow Farm.
Westfield, Indiana, a conservative town in America's Bible Belt, known for small-town hospitality, strong families, and sports, would soon begin to experience something very different. So different that it would stun the community's grip on normalcy. Soon, the wayward sons of Westfield began to go missing. Each time the situations seemed to mirror one another, with the names seemingly being the only details to change. What started out as one person suddenly disappearing began to multiply. Each time, each victim only crafting a local article or two. Each person who went missing was gay or suspected of being gay. So as one can imagine, in a small and conservative town, authorities often believed that these people skipped town, as they often did, or moved on to larger and more glamorous cities, perhaps ones that could cater better to their lifestyle choices. Instead of viewing these young men as victims, they often only viewed their families as the true victims, since they were never informed as to why the men left, and wouldn't receive as much as a goodbye. But as time would tell, those wayward sons never truly left Westfield, with each disappearance being almost a carbon copy of the previous. Several members of the community, including some of the men's families, grew increasingly alert and anxious that something was terribly wrong. With little to no help from law enforcement at the time, several families hired private investigators to further try and figure out just what had happened to their sons. The first to suspect something malicious was a PI by the name of Virgil Vandegrift. With close ties to multiple law enforcement agencies, he soon would make waves with what he believed to be taking place. That these young men did not simply skip town, but were possibly the victims of foul play. After months of convincing and strong efforts by Vandegrift, himself, along with others actually in law enforcement, began to search, leaving no stone unturned. Their trail would end in the backyard of a massive private estate, but for all their efforts and years of experience, nothing would prepare them for the monstrous crimes that they would uncover. Within that backyard was a true field of horrors, buried both deep and shallow, some not at all, were the remains of a suspected 25 victims. Their bones scattered throughout the land, as if they weren't even human at all. Shocked and appalled by the discovery, The media was soon contacted, and efforts were made to find the man suspected of these atrocities. A man that no one suspected, a local businessman by the name of Herbert Baumeister. With each shovel full of earth, more bone fragments would be discovered, and the mystery continued to deepen. And the suspect was nowhere to be found. Behind the eyes of this smiling neighbor was a darkness, an abyss of deception and evil that we are still trying to come to grips with today. But to understand the monster of a man, we must first understand his story, starting from the beginning. Born April 7th, 1947, in Indianapolis, Indiana, he was the first of 4 children to be born to Dr. Herbert Baumeister Sr. and his wife Elizabeth. As Dr. Baumeister's practice grew, so did the family's wealth. They would eventually move from a modest middle-class neighborhood to the upper echelons of the suburbs in Indianapolis. All seemed normal for the young boy at first, playing with other neighborhood kids, toys, and his siblings. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But as he began to age into adolescence, he began to exhibit strange and often antisocial behavior. Some of his actions would include urinating on his teacher's desk and playing with dead animals. One of his only friends during this time was a person named Donovan, who would later explain that Herbert would dive into repulsive revelries, expressing to him the desire to taste human urine and other strange and often sexually deviant fantasies. What caught the attention of the staff at his school was that one morning when walking to school, Herbert would come across a dead crow that had been hit by a car. He picked up the poor creature and proceeded to stuff its body into his pocket and went to class like normal. Later in the day, when the teacher wasn't paying attention, he took the dead bird out and placed it on her desk. Its gnarled and twisted body on full display to his peers and his teacher. This incident made his parents aware that Herbert wasn't just an oddball or going through changes, but something was deeply wrong with his psyche. His father, a licensed doctor, quickly sent the boy away for mental evaluation. After a lengthy series of tests, it would be determined that the young man suffered from schizophrenia, being determined to have a split personality as well. Although his diagnosis is a matter of public record, no further treatment for him can be determined, although we can assume, at least for a time, he received medication for the disease. As he progressed into high school, the small and socially odd Herbert didn't fit in with his sports-playing peers. This led to a deep withdrawal into himself and into isolation. He seemed to have no interest in school or girls or any of the typical things a boy his age would be into. He was just directionless. This directionless state would persist into his college years, where he would drop out multiple times over the course of his time there, never finishing or graduating. Worried about his son, the aging Dr. Baumeister pulled some strings with a friend of his in the community and got Herbert hired on as a copy boy for the famous paper, the Indianapolis Star. He was eager and well-dressed, but again, couldn't seem to quite fit in. Attempting to become one of the crew with his fellow staff members, he offered to drive them to a University of Indianapolis football game, to which they all agreed. As they waited outside of the office with their dates in tow, the crew was shocked when Herbert arrived in a hearse wearing a full chauffeur's outfit. It's speculated that he acquired the hearse through one of his father's friends within the medical industry. Weirded out, but not having another way to the game at the time, the men and their dates reluctantly got into the hearse with Herbert and proceeded to drive to the game. But with lights flashing as if in a funeral procession, many cars were moving or pulling over to allow them to pass. This made the people riding in the hearse wonder just what kind of an oddball was working with them and now steering the wheel. The incident, to say the least, did not make him one of the group, and he would soon end up leaving this job. Despite never having much luck with women, to everyone's surprise, Herbert married a woman named Julie Sater in 1971. Having been introduced by a mutual friend, she seemed smitten with the young-faced Baumeister. The two initially hit it off when they discovered they had mutual things in common, both wanting to own their own businesses someday, among other normal things. In the mid-1970s, Julie would give up her job as a high school journalism teacher to focus on her and Herb having a family. And the years to come, 3 children would follow. Fearing for his son's future, Dr. Baumeister yet again pulled some strings to help him and secured a job for his son at the local DMV to allow him to support his new and growing family. A modest job for a seemingly odd but modest man. But it wasn't long before Herbert made it apparent that he wasn't going to fit in here either. He began to lash out at fellow employees for seemingly no reason. These episodes caused several disruptions that would be noticed by the public and management of the facility alike. But despite this behavior, they also noticed that he had an eagerness to achieve, and this eagerness was mixed with a high degree of intelligence, so he was allowed to keep his job. But these outbursts would be far from the end of his antics while working here. He was described as having a bizarre sense of humor, having sent out photos of him and another man in drag one Christmas to the office, and another incident where he urinated on his boss's desk. Perhaps because of his father's connections or leniency on the behalf of management, he somehow was able to keep his job after these events as well. The final straw, however, would come when Herbert decided to urinate on a letter that was going to be sent to the governor of Indiana. For this bizarre incident, he was finally let go. The ever-faithful and supporting Julie returned to teaching to supplement the family's income after the incident. Meanwhile, Herbert would once again be institutionalized for a short while. After being discharged, Herbert, through a series of odd jobs, would eventually land at a local thrift store, and although he felt remedial at first, he soon realized the potential in owning a business like that, and would proceed to gain experience in the day-to-day operations while working there for the next 3 years. During this time, his father, who seemed to always try to guide him in a positive direction and provide a good example for him, would pass away. After discussing the opportunity with his wife, and after a small loan of $4,000 from his now widowed mother, Herbert would open his first Save-A-Lot thrift store in Westfield in 1988. Its success would allow the family to open another store and move from their modest middle-class neighborhood to purchasing a sprawling estate that would become known as Fox Hollow Farm. Complete with 4 bedrooms, elegant woodwork, and an indoor swimming pool, as well as a riding stable. This beautiful home sat on 18.5 acres, which provided the tranquil rural life that Julie had always wanted for her family. The couple was living the American dream on the surface. It would later be revealed that Herb was very manipulative and would always control Julie. Whenever a decision had to be made, he would take control, whether for better or for worse. These episodes would lead to the couple splitting up multiple times, albeit for short periods of time, and would turn their American dream into an American nightmare, one filled with anger and tension. Anger and tension that seemed to be adopted into the walls of Fox Hollow Farm. Julie would often take the children to visit Herb's mother for weeks at a time, leaving him to his own devices, citing business pressures as the reason that he would never join them. Although in reality, their marriage was teetering. She would later reveal that besides these episodes of manipulation, her and Herb only had sex a total of 6 times, throughout their entire 25-year marriage. Despite their problems, however, she always tried to reconcile their differences. That is perhaps why she believed Herb and his ridiculous alibis. One in particular that's shocking was that in 1994 on the family estate, their son was playing in their heavily wooded backyard when he found a fully intact human skull and a half-buried human skeleton. Absolutely shocked at what the boy had found, Julie anxiously waited for her husband to arrive back from work that day to tell him what had happened. Upon his arrival, she showed him the oddity, and he explained to her that it was one of his late father's dissecting skeletons, that he had been storing it in the garage, but decided to bury it after rearranging and cleaning out the garage earlier that year. Case closed. With her mind put at ease, Julie and the rest of the family continued on their normal day-to-day routines, including their ever-frequent visits to Herb's mother's estate. However, Herb had a dark secret. Each time his family would leave, sometimes for weeks at a time, leaving him to do whatever he wanted, he soon became a regular at various gay bars and clubs in the Indianapolis area. Meeting men under the alias of Brian Nice, he developed a routine of his own. He would often meet these men at clubs and bars and convince them to go home with him, typically telling them that the home he was taking them to was not his own, but rather he was the caretaker or maintenance person of it. Upon arriving, he would convince them to make their way with him to the wet bar and pool located within the basement, where after several more drinks, and sometimes cocaine, he would make his move. Often under the guise of wanting to have sex, he would convince them to strangle him during their escapades to further enhance the pleasure. When they would then want the same done to them, Brian would then strangle them to death. This was often done in the nude and either near or in the pool itself. Once deceased, he would dispose of the body in the woodland area of his massive estate, and although it's not 100% confirmed, it is believed that up to 25 men were disposed this way on the property. How Herb was able to keep up his guise of prosperity is anyone's guess. Taking one human life, let alone possibly 25, and being able to live with oneself, let alone function in any capacity, is in and of itself indicative of mental illness, in my opinion. However, soon this erotic and murderous fever dream would come to a fiery and unforeseen ending. The friend of another man who had gone missing, named Tony Harris, noticed Herb, or Brian Smart, staring at a missing persons poster of his friend Roger Goodlin one night in a gay bar or club known as the 501 Club. He noticed the way he stared at the poster, not only for an unusual amount of time, but something in his gut told him that this man had to know something about his missing friend. After several drinks and casual conversation, Brian asked the man to come home with him, his usual routine. Upon arriving, he was told that Brian was the caretaker of the property and that the new family who had just bought the house hadn't moved in yet. He was then hurriedly led to the pool room in the basement. The pool room itself was disheveled and dirty, and filled with mannequins like those you'd find at department stores. Creepy, but not absolutely insane, Tony decided to carry on with the engagement. The two drank several more strong drinks, and after a skinny dipping session, Brian suddenly expressed his desire for Tony to try and asphyxiate him while he pleasured himself. This sudden and strange omission had Tony even more convinced that this man had to know or was responsible to what happened to his friend. Not wanting to ruin his chances of figuring out if Brian Smart was the culprit, Tony did as he was asked, slipping a water hose around Brian's neck as he proceeded. After this first go-around, shockingly, Tony allowed himself to be strangled by Brian as well. As he feigned consciousness, he saw Brian looking over his shoulder with a bizarre and drunken grin. He, however, thankfully, felt Brian ease up, and after a slight pause, he whispered his name in his ear and began to shake him. As he came to, Brian expressed that he had scared him. He let him know that people had died doing this and that he had had accidents. With this, Tony decided to be frank and say, "What happened to Roger Goodlin? Was he one of your accidents? And have there been others?" Hoping to raise a confession, he was quickly disappointed. Brian quickly dismissed the idea and acted like the entire thing was some sort of weird game. He then quickly made himself another strong drink and drank it almost immediately as he poured it. After this, Brian's speech began to slur, and he dozed off on the couch near the wet bar. This gave Tony a chance to try and figure some things out. Making his way quietly but quickly upstairs, he began to rummage through the house, noticing that there were children's toys and women's clothing in almost every room, making it apparent to him that someone had been living there for quite some time. Seeking Brian Smart's real name, assuming now that he was a liar, he sought his wallet for his ID. He found his pants tossed to the side near the couch where he was sleeping and began to rummage through them. He felt a wallet, but as he began to pull it out, Brian began to wake up, causing him to drop them. After he came to, it took some convincing, but Brian finally agreed to drive Tony back to town, telling him that he had been a good sport who really knew how to play. The two then promised to meet again at the 501 Club that following Wednesday. Tony immediately took this information to Vandegrift, who was the PI on his friend's case, and as Wednesday arrived, Vandegrift and his team posted up all around the club to observe just who this Brian Smart was. However, as hours passed, it appeared that Tony had been stood up. Realizing that this had to be the missing piece to the puzzle, Vandegrift contacted the Indianapolis Police Department and spoke with the one person who believed his story, a no-nonsense detective by the name of Mary Wilson, who had worked other cases with him. Realizing that this too had to be the missing link, Mary made arrangements to look into the details further and to try and acquire a license plate number. Meanwhile, Herb Baumeister continued to live in his fever dream of an existence. His marriage to Julie continued, but the cracks that were once hidden became visible. The strains of a sexless and loveless marriage only escalated their fighting, which was now making its way into their day-to-day professional lives and began to affect the business. By the end of 1994, their two locations had taken a plunge. Numbers had declined, and bills began to soar. Julie, who had always been unwavering and supportive despite the blatant issues, threatened divorce but ended up not following through. Instead, she sat by and watched her business decline, her marriage rot, and her husband grow ever stranger and more bizarre in his antics. It was apparent to his family and staff that he was now drinking every day, who would often arrive drunk to the stores. Everything was dirty. The stores began to become cluttered and unkempt, as did their estate's yard and inside the home itself, cluttered and overgrown. A year now had passed since Virgil Vandegrift and Mary Wilson began using Tony's intel to search for the true identity of the man that was known as Brian Smart. Their leads up until this point had gone nowhere, and they were on the verge of giving up. But their luck was about to change. Assuming his presence had cooled down, so to speak, within the gay community, Brian Smart re-emerged on the scene at a club called the Varsity Lounge the evening of August 29th, 1995, and Tony Harris just so happened to be present when he arrived. After a brief and nonchalant chat with him, Tony then quickly made his way to the parking lot to watch Brian drive away and to record his license plate. The plate number was 75237A and did not belong to anyone named Brian Smart, but instead belonged to a man named Herbert R. Baumeister of Westfield, Indiana. He also just so happened to be a well-known wealthy businessman and the owner of a luxurious estate called Fox Hollow Farm, a beautiful home that boasted a swimming pool in its basement. All the information Tony now provided began to check out, and Vandegrift and Mary were convinced that they had their man and began to move in. As the police were closing in, Herb began to unravel. Mary and her boss, Lieutenant Thomas Green, approached Baumeister at his Washington Street store on November 1st of 1995. Without small talk, they told him that he was a suspect in the disappearance of several young men in the Indianapolis community, and that they wanted to search his home. Herb then refused and replied with a fool's smile, and told them that all communications must go through his lawyer. When this failed, Mary then approached Julie, who looked like she had seen a ghost when confronted with the news. She was given Mary's card and urged to call her if she changed her mind to authorize a search. It wasn't until June of 1996, about 6 months after the initial contact was made, that Julie decided to make that call. She had watched her business fail and her marriage dissolve, and her husband devolve into a strange and paranoid wreck. Upon some reflecting, she realized that she no longer felt that loyalty or obligation to him any longer. After arranging the call through her lawyer, Julie took the opportunity to inform Mary about the skeletal remains her son had found in the backyard all those years ago. Thankfully, with Herb out of the house visiting his mother with one of their sons, as soon as humanly possible, with several other detectives with her, Mary anxiously drove to Fox Hollow Farm. The backyard at first glance looked overgrown, but otherwise normal. But as the men began to kick the low grass, they encountered a bone which would turn out to be human. About a foot long and burnt, they quickly knew that they had just stumbled onto something huge. They would discover thousands of bones and bone fragments strewn across the yard, some of them buried and others laying on top of the ground. It was like as soon as they found one fragment, they quickly discovered another, a never-ending trail of horror. Before they could act any further, they took several evidence bags full of bone fragments to the agency's forensic anthropologist at the University of Indiana for examination. He would indeed confirm that they were human and recently deceased. The following day, the estate was sectioned off as a crime scene, and agents quickly got to work collecting evidence. Upon a search inside the home, they discovered the mannequins, wet bar, and pool just as Tony Harris had described. However, they also noticed something that Tony apparently had not. Tucked in the corner of the room was a semi-hidden video camera, one that undoubtedly would have been used to record the murders. Each discovery only deepened the bizarre nature of the mystery as it unfolded. The hunt for Herb Baumeister was now in full swing, as more than 5,500 bone fragments that day alone were pulled from the graveyard upon Fox Hollow Farm. Bits of bone from every part of the body, teeth, and hair. But after departing the lake house at his mother's estate, Herb was nowhere to be found. He had disappeared into the proverbial mist. From what could be determined at the time, Herb had fled in his 1989 gray Buick and was heading north. The following day, he had phoned his brother asking for money for the business. However, it was a futile request. Later, he would enter as a fugitive into Canada and would make his way to Ontario over the course of several days. Then, at Pinery Park on the evening of July the 3rd, Herb would put a .357 Magnum revolver to his forehead and pull the trigger. He left behind a note attributing his decision to a failing business and marriage, but there was no mention of the skeletons left in Westfield. Instead, his final words on the 3-page suicide note stated that he would now eat a peanut butter sandwich, his favorite snack, and then go to sleep. Although never directly proven in trial since he was never apprehended, It's suspected that Herb Baumeister killed up to 25 men over the course of several years at Fox Hollow Farm while acting out his sick fantasies. And although a video camera was discovered, after thorough searching through the Save-A-Lot stores and the estate, no videotapes were ever uncovered, leading many to believe that they could still be out there somewhere, or even buried somewhere. This dramatic end to a bizarre story, however, wouldn't truly be the end, because many over the years have claimed that those whose lives were taken at Fox Hollow Farm never truly left. After rocking the community with the horrific discovery of the proverbial graveyard and the murder farm at Fox Hollow, along with the demise of a once prolific family and businessman, Herb Baumeister, at his own hands, the community did what it could to forget. Talks initially were had about demolishing the property, but that never came to fruition. Instead, it would be purchased by a private investor. Eventually, Fox Hollow Farm would be placed back on the market, and new owners would purchase it more than 2 decades after the bodies were found. Rob and Vicki Graves had found what appeared to be their dream home, looking to escape the big city life and take up a more rural one for themselves and their 2 teenage sons. They found Fox Hollow Farm and were shocked at how affordable it was for the sheer size and quality of the property. Sensing that it was too good to be true, they asked what could possibly be wrong with it, because at a passing glance, it seemed absolutely gorgeous. Then it came to Rob. He had remembered the name from a news broadcast many years ago. Unbeknownst to him and his wife, they were now standing on the very same grounds that were once owned by Herb Baumeister, the notorious serial killer. They immediately brought this up to the real estate agent who was showing them the property, and were immediately told that that was indeed the case. That the private investor had indeed purchased the estate from the widow of Herb following the disturbing discovery of the bodies back in the 1990s. But that it had been completely remodeled from head to toe, removing any and all remnants of what it looked like when the murders had taken place all those years ago. But that's why it was indeed so affordable, because no one wanted to live there due to the history. After some further discussion among the couple, they ultimately decided to purchase the property. Within a couple weeks, the family moves in and falls in love with Fox Hollow Farm. The teenage sons soon make it a habit to play outside and then wash off in the pool in the basement, soon tracking dirt and gravel all throughout the home. One day, Vicki is vacuuming up the dirt that the boys had brought in from the outside around the pool, when suddenly her vacuum loses power. Believing that perhaps she had accidentally unplugged it from the outlet, she plugged it back in and continued her work. Within several more minutes, it happened again. Perplexed this time because she was even more aware and careful about the cord and the outlet, she knew she hadn't unplugged it. So she plugged it back in and triple checked that it wasn't just falling out of the outlet by pulling the cord. Ever more aware this time, she goes back to vacuuming, but keeping a present eye on the cord itself, and to her amazement, it pulls out on its own, as if someone had grabbed and pulled it out of the socket. Startled, she drops the vacuum and is beside herself. She doesn't know how to make sense of what had just happened, and this would just be the beginning of the strangeness that would occur. Rob worked at a car dealership, and one of his employees was a man named Joe. Joe had been a great employee, but had a problem of being chronically late most of the time. As he probed to figure out what was going on, Joe informed Rob that he lived over an hour away and really needed the job and would be willing to move closer if the opportunity presented itself. Well, Rob thought about it and ended up offering Joe a place to rent. Located on Fox Hollow Farm, they had a guest house that they were considering renting out as apartments for quite some time, and this seemed like the perfect opportunity to benefit everyone involved. Joe would indeed move in just a few days later. It takes several hours, but within that time frame, they're able to get everything inside and finish the move. Exhausted, Joe decides to retire for the night with his dog, Fred. As he lays down to sleep in his newly set up bed, he then finds himself in a horrific nightmare. He's being chased throughout Fox Hollow Farm by something he can't see. The dream is so intense that it causes him to sleepwalk, which wasn't something that he was known to do. He began to run while still dreaming, and ran directly into the door frame as he tried to escape the guest house. Falling back, he knocked into a nearby glass of water, which fell and shattered, cutting his hands. The impact and cutting of his hands finally woke him up, and he was forced to sit back and ponder just what had taken place. And things would only intensify from here. Another day soon after, Rob was painting the side of their home a different color. As he and his wife remarked on how nice the finished job will be, she spots something out of the corner of her eye. She had seen a man in a red shirt staring at them. As she broke away from her husband and began to approach the figure, it started to walk away from her and quickly disappeared as if it never existed. The couple then called out and checked the perimeter, but never found anyone. They dismissed the person as nothing more than a curious trespasser. I mean, after all, they did purchase a serial killer's home. They just had to accept that curious people may sneak up just to get a look at their home. Later that night, Joe is doing the dishes in his apartment when he suddenly gets a series of knocks on his front door. Telling the person it'll just be a minute, as he dries his hands off to go and answer the door, the series of knocks begin to grow louder and more aggressive. Thinking it was extremely strange or extremely urgent concerning Vicky or Rob, he went and answered the door as it was still being knocked upon. However, as he opened the door, there was no one to be found. Automatically on guard, he peers outside. The knocking had been happening when he answered the door, so no person could have got very far while he answered mid-knock. He glanced around, and yet saw and heard nothing. He stepped outside and began to examine the roof and the nearby areas, and still there was nothing. Thoroughly weirded out at this point, he made his way back inside and bolted the door locked behind him. He started to make his way back to the kitchen to finish doing his dishes, when he spotted a man standing in his bedroom, staring at him. Upon spotting the figure, his dog begins to growl and make sounds that he's never heard him make before, staring directly in the direction of the bedroom. Already on edge, he ran into the bedroom and flicked the light on, only to discover that there was again no one there. Searching the entire apartment, he again found nothing. Trying to rationalize and clear his mind, he decided to take his dog Fred for a walk to calm down and unwind for the evening. While on his walk around the property, he thought to check on Rob and Vicky's house to see if the lights were on. This would indicate to him that perhaps they were the ones who had knocked on his door, and therefore he could rest easy and figure out what it was about the following morning. However, upon arriving at their house, he found it completely blacked out. They had already gone to bed for the night. Fred, who was always a loyal and obedient dog, always walked with him without a leash and would always follow his commands. However, tonight would be a different story. Deciding to head back to his apartment, he motioned for Fred to join him, but the dog would not budge. He suddenly began to growl and then bolted into the nearby tree line. Instinctively, Joe ran after his dog, but not before seeing what his dog was running after. Before his eyes and the very same tree line was a man in a red shirt. Although he was absolutely terrified, Joe couldn't let anything happen to his beloved dog, so he continued to run towards this man, when suddenly, whoever or whatever this was disappeared before his eyes. Although slightly behind, he would quickly catch up to Fred and now noticed him not acting aggressive at all, but rather showing his belly in submission, staring in the direction of Joe. Joe, knowing his dog, knew that something very strange had to be up with him. he suddenly felt as if someone was staring directly at him. He slowly turned around to see the apparition of a man in a red shirt with a twisted face staring back at him just several feet away. Joe, as most of us would, ran out of there as fast as he could, his loyal companion following him. The two run as fast as they can back to the apartment, where they rush inside, lock and deadbolt the door, and nervously watch out of the blinds for the rest of the night. The following morning, an even more exhausted Joe makes his way to Vicky and Rob's house to discuss the prior night's events. As he's telling both of them what happened, Vicky starts to become emotional. She too had seen the man in red just days earlier. She points to where she saw him, and lo and behold, it's the exact same spot that Joe had encountered the entity the night before. As the day progressed to night, Joe yet again found himself in his apartment, hoping to finally get some rest. But as he settled down in his bed, he was suddenly startled by knocking at his door. As he yelled out, "Who is it?" as he made his way towards the door, he didn't receive an audible answer back, just more aggressive knocking at the door. The door itself now was shaking. Facing his fear of the unknown, mid-knock, Joe throws the door open, only to meet face to face with nothing. As he frantically looks around the yard while holding the door, he notices that the door's knocking apparatus is sticking straight out, as if someone is holding it. It then drops one last time, knocking the door. Absolutely petrified, Joe slams the door and locks it. As he tries to catch his breath and takes several steps backwards, he sees the doorknob begin to turn. Then, without warning, the door bursts open, shattering the lock. The open door yet again reveals no one. After a moment of frozen terror, Joe runs outside and into the front yard of his apartment, screaming and searching all around for just who could be doing this. After several minutes, he stares back into the house through the open front door and sees a man dressed in all white standing there. He's soaked from head to toe in what appears to be water and is screaming in a muted voice, as if he's being held underwater. He then bolts towards Joe and seemingly disappears into a mist. Frantically calling out to his dog Fred to accompany him, Joe frantically makes his way to Rob and Vicky's house on the property. He's so terrified that he's shaking now, and Rob and Vicky are just as scared. They now truly believe that they are dealing with something paranormal in nature. In order to rationalize the situation and make sense of what was taking place, they begin to believe that they're experiencing the results of the murders conducted by Herb Baumeister, and that his victims are either trapped here somehow, or their energy is stuck in an endless loop, replaying their final and tragic moments over and over and over again. Refusing to return to his apartment, Rob and Vicky, being the supportive friends they were, agreed that Joe could stay the night with them, and together they would begin researching online to try and formulate some kind of a plan of action of what to do next. As they collectively scour the Baumeister case information, they find themselves looking at the list of identified victims. As they get deeper into the details, Joe is shocked. He stops them on a picture of a man in a white shirt. That was the man I saw in my apartment, who was soaked from head to toe and screaming. Although this information still scares them, it does help reassure them that they are indeed dealing with the victims of this horrendous tragedy. They are especially convinced, considering many of the remains have never been identified, so they continue to research the case. After several uneventful days, Joe finds himself almost compelled to walk around the property with his dog, except this time in broad daylight. So, apprehensively, he makes his way with Fred to the area where both he and Vicky had seen the man in red on separate occasions. Just past the tree line on the walking path, Joe is stopped by what looks to be a bone. He believes that it's impossible that such a bone could have been missed during the extensive searches over the years, but nonetheless, it was right here, right now, as if it had been placed there for him to discover. Quickly consulting and showing Rob and Vicky the discovery, they too believed that this could be a bone belonging to the mysterious man in red. They ended up contacting the lead detective on the Baumeister case and submitted the bone, which turned out to be a human femur bone, in as evidence and for analysis. They then requested if the investigator himself could come out to the property and explain to them just where things had taken place so they could have a better understanding of what had happened, to which he obliged. Several days passed, and Joe by this point had made his way back to his apartment to try and settle back in given the new information. While on his computer checking his emails, he began to hear a scraping, almost metallic-like sound originating from the kitchen. Upon further examination, he sees that all of his butcher knives from his knife block have been neatly arranged in his sink, placed in a row, equally spaced from one another. Glancing around the room, he spots fresh, deep cuts in the wood of the nearby counter cabinet. He believes that this could be a sign for one of the victims crying for help. He starts to try and figure out the mystery. He takes out his phone and begins recording, asking probing questions to whoever or whatever could be there, in hopes of helping them in any way that he can. Prior to this, of course, he turned off any and all appliances that could interfere with the process. He begins by asking a series of questions and doesn't seem to get much of anything, at least not audibly. But then towards the end of his questions, Fred begins to growl, the same eerie growl he had any time they had experienced something previously. Taking this as confirmation that perhaps his companion could see or hear something that he couldn't, he quickly downloads the audio file and begins to listen to it on his computer. And to his shock, he did indeed receive a response. This is the clip of the actual EVP that was recorded.
Who keeps walking in the kitchen?
He believes he hears the married one. But in all of their research, all of the victims were young, single gay men. The only one who was married was one Herb Baumeister. This revelation is startling. He not only believes that the victims were trapped within the grounds of Fox Hollow Farm, but that perhaps the serial killer himself could too be trapped here. What would follow would be dozens of paranormal investigations. And those investigations would lead the group to believe that they were not only dealing with the spirits of the victims haunting the grounds, but either a dark entity impersonating Baumeister or the killer himself. Several years after the events, the Graves family would end up selling Fox Hollow Farm, and it would continue to change hands over the years since then, leading to multiple new owners of the property. And although new information doesn't seem to be publicly available, it's still considered one of the most haunted places in Indiana, if not the world, given its unique and gruesome history. An independent film would go on to be made about it, called The Haunting of Fox Hollow Farm, and Robert Graves, along with another man named Richard Estep, who led many paranormal investigations at Fox Hollow Farm, would co-write a book detailing the family's creepy experiences and what they believed to be ultimately happening. So in conclusion, we know that Herb Baumeister was mentally ill ultimately, but what makes this case so strange and so compelling to me is that he was an outstanding member of his community. For the longest time, he was the smiling neighbor, the charitable businessman, the happy family man, and overall, a pillar of normalcy. But behind closed doors, his psyche, his soul, contained a darkness that most of us will never be able to comprehend, yet alone unravel and understand. So could the murderous deeds of a twisted individual trap souls on a property and perhaps open some kind of a portal? Could the unleashing of such energy like what is expressed in a violent death contribute to something like this? If it wasn't what's known as an intelligent haunting, where the spirits are aware of what has happened to them and are indeed trapped there, which very well could still be the case, then perhaps it could be a residual haunting, where the events are of such magnitude and strength that they play on a loop for all time, but the souls who were involved have long since moved on. These are questions that we may never have answers to, but all things that we should ponder. The one thing is for certain: the malicious calculation of Herb Baumeister and the horrendous things that he did to the suspected 25 victims at Fox Hollow Farms should never be forgotten. They are indeed still identifying and using updated technology to identify remains that are still being found on the grounds. So if you happen to be a family member of someone that you suspect could be connected to this case, contact the Hamilton County Coroner's Office at 317-770-4415. Besides remembering what happened, I also urge you to please respect the victims and their families, as well as the family of Herb Baumeister, if you should ever have anything to do with them.
Something I didn't originally cover was that many in law enforcement suspected but could never prove that Baumeister was the I70 Strangler. And for those of you who don't know, the I70 Strangler was a serial killer that killed at least 12 people along the Interstate 70 corridor. And the reason he is suspected is, well, given his proven track record and the fact that he often traveled the corridor to Ohio for business, as well as his timeline and his travel habits matched the active years of the killings. But unfortunately, given how things have played out, the world may never truly know for sure if he was or not. Hamilton County Coroner Jeff Jellison, who reopened the case in 2022, has been leading the push to identify victims from the 10,000 remains discovered at Fox Hollow Farm in 1996. This makes it the second largest unidentified human remains case, second only to 9/11. For 30 years, these remains sat on a shelf in a box. There was no work being done by law enforcement or previous coroners to identify them, so these families were just set aside, and they didn't have all the answers. Now, new leads have led to some new revelations in the case, some going towards the identification, and some of those leads also were forwarded to law enforcement partners. Delving into the cold case, Jellison sent 44 individual bones or fragments recovered from the Fox Hollow Farm property to the Indiana State Police Laboratory for analysis. Jellison and his team were ultimately able to identify 2 additional people. Daniel Thomas Halloran, identified in April of 2025 as the 10th positive victim match, a man who went missing around 1993 and was not previously on missing persons lists. And Roger Goodlett was confirmed via advanced DNA profiling as the likely first victim buried on the property. With the newly released docuseries on the subject on Hulu, new life has seemingly been breathed into this case for the first time in ages. And it's completely possible that further victims may still be identified. And for those who lost loved ones to these heinous acts, my heart goes out to you, and it is my hope and desire that all who need it gain closure in the end, and that Baumeister is somewhere in the afterlife, where he truly belongs. Thank you guys so much for watching this half revisited, half new video, so to speak. I wanted to cover the topic again because it's as interesting as it is horrifying in every respect, and I wanted to share the latest updates so that people who follow the case are kept up to date. If you liked the video, please give it a like below, subscribe if you haven't already, and please leave me a comment letting me know your thoughts or speculations and or case suggestions. I appreciate you guys bearing with me as I craft these new episodes. I truly could never take your patience for granted. Thank you all for your love and support, and as always, this has been Cody here at Mystery Archives. Make sure to stay safe out there, and take care. I'll see you next time.